Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. This is the podcast that discusses everything related to vertebrate pest control from a research-based technical perspective. So, hey, glad to have you on board. I hope you're doing well. I hope your week went well. I've been doing some traveling, doing some training in my day job. Not receiving training, giving training. I want to be sure I'm clear on that. I'll be going to get some training next week when I'm out at the Vertebrate Pest Conference. If you're out in California at the Vertebrate Pest Conference, definitely come by and visit with me. So I'll be giving 2 different talks there. So looking forward to that, and also looking forward to listening to some of the other presentations and try to expand my own horizons while I'm out there. So definitely check me out. This week, we're going to be revisiting biases and how cognitive biases interfere with our business and actually harm our wildlife control work. You may recall that I've done a previous podcast on this. So this will be part 2 of the cognitive biases. So if you missed the first one, go back a couple of episodes and you'll see my podcast on cognitive biases part 1. But in the meantime, definitely we would appreciate if you take a few moments and subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and if you could give us a 5-star review, we'd be most grateful for that. If you need to reach out to me, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you, thoughts about new shows. Perhaps you have a product or a business that you'd like to talk about. Perhaps there's just an issue within the industry that you want to chat about. I would love to have you on the show. I think there's a lot of good information out there from you practitioners in the field, and as well as people trying to sell materials. Would love to get your information out to a wider audience. Again, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I do have to take a couple moments here and ask a question of the audience. Namely, is there any interest in a podcast on how to pass the new COA CWCP exam? If you are interested in that, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, and look at putting together a podcast on how to prep for that particular exam. So it might be helpful for other exams out there as well, but we'll talk specifically about that certification exam. All right, well, this week we're going to be talking about cognitive biases part 2. Let me pull my PowerPoint up here and get that particular setup here. And so we're going to do this from the current slide. There we go. So you should be seeing that. And so again, the title of the presentation is How Biases, what we call cognitive biases, this is how we think, can hurt our business, part 2, because I've already dealt with several cognitive biases earlier on. So this one's going to get into maybe some lesser known cognitive biases that you may not have been familiar with, but maybe not. Let's take a look and see. Well, the first bias I'd like to talk about is hindsight bias. And so hindsight bias is how we overvalue a past loss or a failure or success in guiding future decision making. And so this is a huge one within wildlife control and in our lives in general. We tend to assume if we did something and we had success with it, therefore doing it again, we're automatically going to be getting success with that in the future. Just think of it for a moment if you're doing some trapping and you put out a certain type of bait in a particular situation, and all of a sudden you just capture the animal really quickly and you resolve the job and you're like, wow, I'm like a rock star, and you just got it all done. And you begin to think that all future jobs are going to be like that if you use the same techniques. That's a form of hindsight bias. And so where we actually overvalue that positive event that we had rather than looking at that type of experience from a broader pool of experience. So this is the problem of hindsight bias, because experience, of course, is extraordinarily valuable. We don't want to undercut that. But sometimes we overvalue our own individual experience, either to the positive or to the negative. And so you may have parents, for example, that went through or experienced the loss of, or I should say grandparents by this point in time, or great-grandparents, who went through the Depression, and they became very nervous about putting their money in a bank. Why? Because the pain of those banks failing, and there were a lot of banks that failed during the Great Depression, caused them to not trust banks and put the money in a seat cushion, or in terms of their bed cushion, their bed mattress, right? So this is a problem that people have when they have a deeply traumatic event that can blind them to future opportunities. And this happens to us, of course, in investing. And then vice versa, if we have a significant win with something, we tend to think it'll always turn out to be the same way in the future. And unfortunately, life is chaotic, and while there are principles that, if you do X and do Y, you should end up being successful, there's no guarantee of that often, because things happen, right? You could get hit. We tell people, get an education, go find a career, whether you're being an electrician or going to college. Thankfully, college is being put in its proper place in America today, rather than just being the sole way to build a career. But nevertheless, people will say, I made the right decision and everything's going well, and therefore later on in life everything should be fine. So people who tend to think that because their experience with college gave them a great career, therefore everyone else's decision to go to college should come up with the same way. And of course, we all know that that's no longer the case. So how do we address hindsight bias? Well, making sure that when we're making decisions based on our experience, we want to be sure we have a broad enough variety of experience. And we also want to think about some of the nuances that made us think about either that significant loss or that significant gain, and how that can blind us in terms of our understanding of that experience. So, something to think about. Look out for hindsight bias. The next bias I'd like to talk about is oversimplification bias, and this is where we make a decision based on minimal data or insufficient data rather than considering all the options in data. Now, this one has a little bit of personal appeal to me, because I've experienced the negative side of this bias. And you get it from people who think that because you wrote a book and they read maybe parts of the book, and they think that, well, that's no big deal because they knew the information that was in the book. Therefore, what's the big deal with the book? They think that the book really isn't valuable. Now, it may not be valuable to them in the sense that, they didn't necessarily learn anything new, although I would often dispute that. The point is that they tended to denigrate and devalue the book simply because they thought, well, it's no big deal. It's not that hard to do. But yet when you ask them, well, why don't you write your own book? They have a challenge. And this is a big problem. You'll sometimes see this at conventions where some people are chosen to speak in front of the audience, and you'll get sometimes some murmurs maybe among people who think, well, I want to be a teacher. I want to get up and speak. No one's invited me. I've got a lot to say. And they think it's no big deal. It's not that hard. And yet, when they go up and do it, and you find that, they really didn't do that good of a job. Why? Because they didn't know all that was involved in being a good public speaker. You see this at times when it comes to PowerPoints, when people think, oh, that's no big deal. I know all about PowerPoints. And yet when they are under the pressure of putting together their own PowerPoint, they find that it's not something that they can do in just, 20 minutes and be done with it. Or they guess they could, but it might just be a load of crap or they haven't finished. And you'll find this in terms of my own company, where people think, I don't need a consultant. I don't need to have Stephen work in my PowerPoints. I don't need to have Stephen help me with my writing if I'm, putting together a brochure for my company or putting together training material for my company, because I know how to do all that. Or it's just too simple. And yet when they try to do it, they think that it's no big deal. I reviewed a book once, and there was some really good information in this book. Unfortunately, there were so many errors in it grammatically, and I'm not a prude as much on grammar and writing and that sort of thing. For me, does the writing make sense, rather than being the King's English, so to speak. But there were a lot of errors that were distracting from the reading experience because the writer just didn't take the time to review it properly, or just didn't get some outside help. Those are examples of oversimplification bias, and they do impact us. Your clients do it to you, and they think, oh, is that all it is? You're just putting a trap in the backyard and throwing some bait in the bag? Well, I could have done that. That's an example of oversimplification bias. Okay? So try not to do it to others, and certainly don't let them do it to you. Availability bias. Now, this is something where it's a little nuanced here, and this is where we make a decision based on information that's readily available rather than doing the research required to get the full answer. And so this is sort of like we take the easy answer rather than reading more and getting to the real information. This is another bias that I certainly suffer from in my business, or I'm a victim of this bias, because people think, well, I'll just answer the question. I'll just get the question answered on Facebook. I'll just get the question answered. I'll just Google it, right? As if everything on Google can be easily every answer can be easily derived from a Google search. That's an availability bias, and it's a significant problem in the wildlife control field, partly because you're in the business of wildlife control because you don't want to be a book learner, right? And so if you were a book learner, you would have gone to college, right? And if you're not, then you go into a trade where you're working with your hands. Just like I'm not someone who loves working with their hands. I went into a more academic program, as opposed to other people that go into a trade that go into something where they're working more with their hands, whether it be an electrician. And so This is the problem. But yet the challenge is just like people who don't understand that experience is important, so also we have people that don't understand that book learning can be important. So we tend to bias our evaluation of evidence based on what's available to us and what's comfortable to us, rather than seeing how we need to engage both those who have experience and those who have technical information from the published literature, right? And so this is a problem because our industry, we tend to say, I just want the quick answer, and sometimes there aren't quick answers. Let me give an illustration. I think there is a tremendous need in our industry for a compilation of information on exclusion. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, what type of wire mesh can a raccoon break through? What kind of wire meshes can a pocket gopher gnaw through? How many millimeters does that mesh need to be thick? What's the hardness of that metal? What does it have to be for a pocket gopher not to be able to gnaw through it? We don't have good information. By that I mean we have people that have opinions on some of that stuff. But what we don't have is where that's collected to see what that information is across a wide field of experience. Let me illustrate another way. We tend to think that, how tall of a fence do you need to have to keep a deer out of your garden? Now, you'll hear in the marketplace, and there's actually research to back this up, people will say, well, 8-foot fence should do it. And the answer to that is yes, an 8-foot fence should do it. But did you know that there are deer that can jump an 8-foot fence? So when we talk about what kind of a fence do you need to keep a deer out of your garden, we have to answer the question as well, do you need 100% perfection? Or do you need to have, maybe 99% certainty? That's two different questions, right? But we tend to be flippant and we just say, it's just going to be 8 feet. And 8 feet is going to do it the majority of the time. And you might never experience a deer jumping over an 8-foot fence, but there are deer that have. What about a 6-foot fence? A lot easier to build a 6-foot fence than an 8-foot fence. How many deer jump over a 6-foot fence? Well, you might get sufficient amount of control with a 6-foot fence. It depends on the situation. But what we tend to want is easy answers that are easily provided or easily available. And that's part of the availability bias. Rather than doing the reading necessary to provide that nuanced answer. One of the quotes I love to use, and that is, a simple lie is easier to believe than a complex truth. All right, let's move on. Action bias. Well, this is certainly one that's rife in our particular industry, right? Because people in our industry are motivated to get something done, right? If you need to get that animal removed, you're calling someone from the vertebrate pest industry, and boom, it's going to get done. But it can be a problem when we are too quick to make decisions rather than seeing if the information that we have is actually valid. So this is where we make a decision quickly rather than wait to see if the information we have is good. Now, a classic example of this, of course, is where people are investing. They put money into the stock market on a tip without understanding whether the information or the tip is actually accurate. Well, how do we do that in the wildlife control field? Well, this is where someone will take information perhaps they've gotten on Facebook or from a Google response, and they act on it rather than thinking, well, is this information actually true? Do I understand all of the nuances of this information? Let me give an illustration. That is, you may read an article, and I probably talked about it here in our podcast, and says that, mice do hear in the ultrasonic range. So if you see something online that says this is an ultrasonic repellent or frightening device that's supposed to keep mice away from a particular area, you may come to the conclusion, well, mice can hear in the ultrasonic range. This is an ultrasonic device that's supposed to repel them away, therefore it must work. Well, it's more complicated than that. But yet you may go out and purchase this particular device and buy it before you have all the information about whether or not it works. Last one I want to talk about here is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is a serious one. Serious because of how devastating its effects are to us if we have this particular problem. The Dunning-Kruger effect, or syndrome as it sometimes can be called, is when we overestimate our abilities. And it often happens that if we think we're smart in one area, we think we're smart in other areas that we have no actual experience in or training in. For example, this research was done on the basis of asking people who thought of themselves smart, they were college students, and then they would ask them some specific logical questions to see how they did, and then I think they would self-evaluate if memory serves. How often do you see in the United States, for example, how we interview kids and we say, are you good in math? And they all say they're good in math, and then you look at American test scores in math and compare that to South Korea. When you go to South Korea and you ask, are you good in math? And they'll say, no, I'm not good in math. And yet the average Korean student is head and shoulders above the average American student. We have a Dunning-Kruger effect here, right? We think we're smarter in math because we think we're smarter in math, and we're not. And then if we go to college, we think that because we went to college, we're somehow going to be smart in other areas. Just think of those of you that ever watched the show American Idol, and they go through the trials that people go through, to see if they're going to pass on, be moved on to the main show. How many of those people think that they're good at singing? And you're like, how did they ever come to that conclusion? How many times do your clients tell you that you're on the ladder doing your work and your client's telling you how to do your job? I mean, I had one person, I was like, why am I here if you know everything, do it yourself. And all of a sudden the guy walked away, right? So these are examples of the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's very important to think that just because we may be smart in one area doesn't necessarily mean we're smart in another. It's where we need to have an accurate assessment of ourselves. And this is part of one of the benefits I think that's overlooked in a real college education. I mean, a real one, not... In a real college education, you are being exposed to ideas that are antithetical to those that you believe, or maybe that you were raised with, and you have to struggle with that challenge. Now, in a good school, they're not trying to indoctrinate you, but they're conscious about what they truly believe. Unfortunately, most of the education in our country today is driven by Marxist ideology, and that's where a lot of these ideas are being put into our kids, and our kids aren't able to see the alternative viewpoints, right? And why one of the problems with Marxism. So what happens is they end up jettisoning what they've learned in either their own experience or from their parents just because their professor who has the power of a grade over them, and then they get swept up into that and then they become liberals. and that sort of thing. But I digress. The point is that you want to be sure that just because you're smart in one area, that you're not necessarily smart in another, right? Just because you're a great wildlife control operator doesn't make you a great person at PowerPoint, or doesn't necessarily make you a great speaker or a great educator, any more than being a great educator or a person with PowerPoint means that you're automatically a great trapper, right? Or a wildlife control operator or whatever. We have to understand that we need to have the humility to know what our limits are, what we know and what we don't know. This is what education can help us do, is to recognize the depth of our ignorance, how much we don't know. This is why in the academic world, when you get a PhD, you're a doctorate of philosophy in science. You're a doctorate of philosophy in medicine. You're a doctorate of philosophy in, whatever the case may be. And they say, well, what's philosophy have to do with it? Because you're actually thinking about thinking in your particular field. It's called meta-analysis, where you're thinking about thinking. Okay, metacognition. And so one of the things we do in this particular podcast is I want you to be thinking about wildlife control and the principles and concepts, not just simply, all right, where do you put the trap? How do you do X? We're thinking about the whole process in depth. And so that's what makes this a deeper education than perhaps other types of podcasts out there in wildlife control. All right, well, that's pretty much it for me on this point. Let me kind of close out on my PowerPoint and get back to my website here. I hope you enjoyed this particular podcast, learning part 2 about different biases and cognitive biases that can affect our ability to do wildlife control work and run our businesses properly. We need to be sure that we're accurately understanding the world around us and the situation so that we can then solve the problems that our clients so desperately need. And so, know thyself. Knowing what our biases are can be very helpful in us overcoming it, being able to identify those biases and be sensitive to them, so then we can work to actively counteract the negative effects. Not all biases are bad. I wanted to make sure the last time. Not all biases are bad, but we want to be sure we understand when we have a bias to the extent that possible for us to do that. Well, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife podcast as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Do hope you enjoyed this. Definitely ring the bell. Do subscribe to the channel if you can. Give us a 5-star review, and because if you support idea of technical information in the field of wildlife damage management, I hope that you would support us here. For those of you that don't like dealing with YouTube, you can definitely find my information up on Rumble. Just go to Wildlife Control Consultant and you can subscribe there. I often post my podcast sooner there than it gets put up on YouTube. If you need to reach out to me, would love to hear from you, your thoughts about the show. Definitely don't forget to talk about whether you're interested in that CWCP training. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. If you have presentations or projects that you need to work on that are, that involve writing or PowerPoints, definitely reach out to me. Would love to talk to you about perhaps providing some of those services for you. I've done work in the area of doing writing protocols as well as writing trainings for other people as well. We can certainly create material copywriting for that you would be giving to your clients to help them understand your business and things that they need to do. So you know how to reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. So this is Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.